Our first presenter today, Gerald Blaquiere, his question, or his question, we'll get to his question in a second, his topic, we need to talk, closing churches in the United Church of Canada. Gerald, we're in your hands.
Thank you. I'm going to sit. I threw my back out the other day and standing's a little painful, so hope you don't mind. It's really good to be here. I'm really nervous, but it's good to see you all. Faces are familiar. I'm just going to start off with a few bears of one of my favorites. And Judy Collins does do it better than the Birds. Oops, that's fine. You get the idea. My first memories of church were being of a certain age, probably the oldest person in the room here today, going to the Catholic Church in Campbellton where I was a member, and we would have 2 services every Sunday in an 800-person church, and it was full most Sundays. We had 2 full-time priests, full-time staff, full-time organist or music director. We had all sorts of wonderful things, and Sunday mornings were big events, and basically our neighborhood where we grew up was comprised of mostly war veterans, and on Sunday mornings the neighborhood's cleared out because everybody went to church. It was a different world. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, and I can say that because there's a bridge in Campbellton. And most churches are substantially smaller when it comes to congregational sizes. The buildings are still there. My own home church, the United Church of First United in Campbellton, still has a wonderful organ, has a wonderful organist. But on Sunday mornings now, numbers are anywhere between maybe 80 and 100. Mostly folks who are older than I am. The times are changing rather rapidly. It's not an isolated phenomena. I live next to a boarded up church in Juniper, New Brunswick, and I'm reminded every day of what's happening in our own church, the United Church of Canada, and in other churches across the country. If one looks at the Maritime Conference, job openings, most of the openings, not most, but the last time I checked, over half, at least half, if not more, of the openings were for part-time ministry, half-time ministry. And some of those that were full-time were because they combined 2 charges to 2 half-time positions to make a full-time ministry. So in effect, full-time jobs are getting rare because there's just not enough churches and not enough people. We're reluctant to discuss the huge elephant in the room, the fact that we're dying as a congregation. We're closing congregations at a steady, and I believe, soon to be increasing rate, given the average age of our congregants. And yet, to the best of my knowledge, we're not addressing the problem. At least not in a way that will help those churches who have closed to do so with grace, with help from beyond. The churches that I've experienced or spoke to about closing have had little help from presbytery because presbytery is mostly volunteers and they don't know any more about it than the congregation does. And what happens is you may have somebody on a certain presbytery at one time who knows something, but when that person gets off the committee or moves on, then you've got to start all over again. There's been a great lack of communication between presbytery and home congregations about church closing because really nobody wants to discuss it. I'm hoping that this project will open that conversation up for a bit more discussion. I've seen a lot of hurt in churches, and we'll be talking about that today as well. And I just had a few slides of full churches and empty churches, which I'm supposed to be progressing as I talk, but I can't chew gum and talk at the same time, sort of, so we'll have to work with this. Given the advancing age of church members, declining numbers, financial situations, we're closing more than a church a week right now in the United Church of Canada. Since I began this project in June, we've closed 22 congregations, and yet we haven't had that discussion. I put here the human life cycle for the simple reason that when you look at the average age of our congregation, go over to the right-hand side and you're looking at senior adult and elderly adult. That would describe most of our congregations, or many of our congregations. And you know what comes after that. And yet, the discussion is not being had. We haven't had a positive year of church growth since 1983 in the United Church of Canada. It just hasn't happened. That's 30 years ago. And to the best of my knowledge, and this is just the best of my knowledge, mind you, at our general council level, at conference and presbytery, we don't have people dedicated to palliative care in our church. And it's so funny because as a church, we're doing more funerals than anything else. It's time we had the talk. For this grad project, this by the way, this chart is from 1927 up until 2011, the rate of church closures. Now, if this were your business, it wouldn't look that great, would it? But that's what's happening in our church, in the United Church of Canada. And I expect that if you go to where the last digit is here, into the next 10 years, it's going to go like this, because the average age is so high. And given the demographics of the churches, I think it's going to increase. Now, for this grad project, I've had to focus on a few things, obviously, and I've chosen to focus my study on two aspects only. First is the experience of people that have gone through a church closure, how they've been affected, and believe me, they've been affected. And the second, and this is going to be a bigger one to chew off than I thought it was, Jody, is the development of a user-friendly resource for churches forced to close. There's a dearth of information out there, and much of it is difficult to find. It's my hope to help change that by developing a resource that will be user-friendly for congregations and presbyteries as they go through the inevitable church closures that are to come. It hopefully will contain the information we need, and plus make it a bit of a personal thing that we're closing personally, spiritually. What do we do as we have to go through this process? I'm hoping to make it such a resource that will make for a little less anger, a little less confusion in the event of church closure. So my question, I guess, basically is twofold. How have we experienced church closing? And how can we as a church help congregations that have to die to do so with grace? Writings concerning church literature tend to be short and subjective for the most part. And the 4 books that I was able to find were pretty much that, fairly short. And with the exception of 1 or 2, they were all under 100 pages. A few of them contained some case studies that the actual writer of the book actually experienced with people, but very little. I found very little qualitative research on the experience of church closure. One of the things I'm hoping, and I mentioned this to somebody this morning, I forget, but my legacy from this project will not be so much this presentation or my paper that I'm going to present, but it's going to be a bibliography. Of the 4 books that I have read, Two of them had bibliographies, and in those two books with bibliographies, only about 2 or 3 items reflected church closure. The rest were from quotes from philosophers or from sociologists or from whatever else. But very, very few actual resources that would approach church closure. So I'm hoping that the bibliography that I will be preparing with this study, and it will be available to everybody, will help those who have to go through church closure. So how have we experienced church closing? And how can we as a church help congregations that have to die in peace? Well, with the literature, the first book, and this is sort of the go-to book for most people, I guess, and it's the only book referenced in 2 of the other books on church closure. It just goes to show how little material there is out there. Ending with Hope with Beth Ann Gade is an Alban resource, and she has a lot of good stuff in there. And one thing she wrote in particular is, I talked a minute or 2 ago about the life cycle of adults or human beings, and she just gave us a little review of the life cycle of a church. And the first part, formation, the dream, dreamers are alive, and everybody's gung-ho and ready to rock and roll with it. The second part is putting it into action. The congregation grows in many ways, including numerically, to reach a stable and healthy size. Now, we still have some of those congregations in our church, and I know some folks here have that type of congregation, and that's great. It's good to see that. The third stage is stabilization. We have quite a few congregations that are stable now. They're functional. They're working well. Life is good right now for them. But we have so many congregations that are in breakdown mode right now. The dreams being forgotten, nostalgia for past glories comes alive, and survival begins to take a large part of the church's life. I serve a congregation like that right now. We are fighting for survival, and there's just such a dedicated congregation, but the writing's on the wall. The age is there, the numbers are not there. And of course, crisis. The life cycle ends either in the congregation's death or its revitalization. That's pretty much self-explanatory, I guess. Now, the other books, I'll just go over them very briefly. Empty Houses, and I only found this one this past week, by Michael Jones. He's a United Church minister in Calgary. The book is fairly long, not a lot of detail in it. There's quite a bit of philosophical concepts explored and everything else, but it's a bit lengthy for a congregation trying to close a church. Another one that I enjoyed was the Finishing with Grace. This is an e-book. It's available online, and it's written from a really nice perspective of peace, of appreciative inquiry, she calls it. And look at what you have, look at what you had, be grateful for it, and go into closing if you have to close, or amalgamation or merging. Go into it with that attitude, gratefulness, appreciative, and if you approach it in that manner, it certainly makes the project a lot easier, and I think there's a lot less anger involved. And the last one, The Role of a Minister in a Dying Congregation. Excellent resource. There actually has checklists in it. So there's some stuff you can use to get things going if you have to close a congregation. Other than that, there's a ton of resources available online. I'm going to have them all, not all, but all the ones that I could find in a bibliography. And at the end of the presentation today, I'm going to have my email address up there. So if any of you want copies of whatever I'm doing, I'd be more than pleased to email it to you at the end of the whenever I finish in January, hopefully the first week of January. And I'll be glad to send you those resources because some of them are great. There's the Catholic Diocese of Boston has a really extensive manual on church closure, and there are others out there that are quite good. So yeah, I'll be glad to share those things with you if you'd like. I better move on. Okay, the questions I asked my interviewees were fairly simple, and they were sort of, how do you feel, and how do you feel about that? And I have to admit, Jody, Jody went in our classes in June. I don't want to say I was a doubting Thomas or anything else, but Jody said 4 or 5 interviews is enough. And I said, how can you have a valid experience with 4 or 5 interviewees? Well, you can. You can. The themes developed with those 4 people that I had not expected I would see happening. And we're going to discuss some of those now. Grief and pain. Now, I'm dealing with 2 congregations here that have closed their churches about 5 years ago. They basically had to do this, but there was very little preparation for an amalgamation into a 3rd church. And as a result, the pain is pretty extensive with them. I guess I don't need those. What we're going to do is just look at some of the comments. I wasn't prepared for the grief and the pain that I saw 5 years after church closure. And it so happens that the other course I'm taking right now is on psychosocial aspects of oncology and palliative care. And I could see relations, just so much in common with the grief process between closing a church that has been a part of your life for your whole life and losing a person. Gwen, and the names are fictitious, of course. Now, this is my first interview, okay? And I thought, how am I going to get enough material? Because, well, how do you feel about it? I'm hurt, very hurt. That's it. Okay, so how do we expand on this? But after we got talking and we got comfortable with each other, everything started coming very well. Jane, there wasn't acceptance that it had to close, even though they saw the figures in black and white. A lot of pain, a lot of pain. And she says they, but I think she meant we. Gordon, it's affected the whole congregation. It's hurt the congregation more than it has me personally. I'm one of the younger ones, and I don't mind driving to the new charge. Well, that's true, but you'll see later that Gordon also was hurt quite badly. Gordon is the only one of the 4 who's remained active in the church. Of the 4 people, I chose 2 who continue to come to church and 2 who stopped coming to church. And of the 2 who come, only Gordon is active in the new church, and he doesn't mind it, but it's still not his church. And that's I'll try to get that to that a little bit later if I have time, but there's reasons for that. Jill, what really hurt me most was what they did over here. Jill didn't feel a part of the conversation the whole way through, even though there were congregational meetings. But she just was not in the loop. Whether it was her own fault or not, it wasn't. So when things happened, they were surprises. And Jill was, of the most, Jill's interview was the most painful. She cried halfway through it. And it was difficult for both of us. I had asked her if she wanted to discontinue, and she said, no, let's do this. And she did, and she was totally honest. What was done wrong was one of the questions I asked. A lot of confusion and a perceived sense of a lack of leadership. Gordon, we had a student minister here at the time, and these are sort of literal, okay, I didn't correct for grammar or anything else, it's just as they were written. Was very inexperienced and never dealt with one of these before, and I put closing in brackets. Jill, it's just the way the minister handled. It was going to go through anyway, is the impression I got. And to me, I don't think she cared what people were thinking or feeling. That's probably not true, but you know what? It's what she felt, and perception is reality to those who perceive. Gwen, well, things should be explained a lot better to people once they're considering closing the church. She's probably right. And this is hopefully where we will, we'll get into this a little bit later as well. What was done wrong again? Disconnect from other churches. Jane, not that those people are rude or unwelcoming or anything like that. You just feel like you're going to somebody's home and upsetting the apple cart. They've got their system of doing things, and you try not to upset them, but it's just not the same in the home feeling you would have in your own church. This, to me, showed a really strong lack of coordination. And when they were closing the old churches and in the new churches, there was no discussion had as to, okay, what do we do together to make it our church? It was two churches closing and going to their church. And that was really painful because, we'll get to this some more anyway. I'm looking at the time here. So now what are they doing? Red hymn books, now this is a little confusing, which were donated in memory of people in A and B. No, they didn't even need to have one for the organist. In other words, one of the churches used the old hymn books and the other two churches didn't. No, excuse me, two of the other churches used the Voices United and the church that they were amalgamating with didn't. And the church they were amalgamating with said, well, we don't want them. So there was no, sense of being together in the whole process. They use it now, mind you, but still. Disconnect from other churches again. There's something about C that just doesn't work for me. C would be the amalgamated church. I just can't commit myself to go every Sunday. Nothing against anybody else, but it's just not working for me. I don't feel that C is my church. I feel that we're visitors there. Jill, I came down the road one day and the doors and the windows were boarded up. She was surprised. This is one of the churches that closed. I mean, obviously they had to do something with it, but it wasn't explained to them. And so she came down the road one day and all the stained glass windows were taken out and the church was boarded up. And that was the day she stopped coming to church, period. It just was too much for her. Gordon, I knew that there would be hard feelings, but I didn't know there would be hard feelings to the extent that there are, and there still are. Some people have stayed away in this amalgamation, which happened over 4 years ago, and there's still anger. There are still people, Jane says, who will not talk to me. This is years after we closed our church. Their experiences are, you can still feel them today. And this one here was really sad because our church, with the windows boarded up and everything, is like a scar. It reminds you every day of what you don't have anymore. That was painful. And this church is still there, still standing. And what happens is they closed with no sufficient funds to dispose of the building in any way, shape, or form. And so as a result, the building is just deteriorating. So it's a constant reminder of what they've lost. What do you think could be done better? I'd like to see guidelines on what to do as the process unfolds. And this is what I'm hoping to develop. Maritime Conference has a guideline now, as does the Ontario Bay of Quinte Conference. I have their stuff, and I have the manual, of course, but I also have a lot of other literature that I'm going to try to shorten and yet enrich the process for people, and that'll be happening in the second part of my project. Gordon, it would have been nice to have had information from congregations who have gone through the process. Most churches, it's been my experience, that close do so alone, with limited help from presbytery. If presbytery is fortunate enough to have somebody who knows what they're talking about, but it's a solitary experience. They die alone, just like many people. Just to make sure people really understood better, Jill says, I don't think we really understood just exactly what it was all about. And Gwen said, well, things should be explained a lot better to people once they're considering closing the church. And those are the experiences of the people I had. I mean, I could go on a lot longer with these experiences because they were so much in the room while we had the interviews. But I'll go on to just briefly now to the second part of my project. And I've entitled it New Directions, and it's a resource for congregations in transition. And in it, what I hope to have and to present, hopefully put it online if it's good enough that people can use it. So when somebody is closing a church, they can go to the Maritime Conference website or even their local presbytery website and download this and have a resource with a bibliography with, what do we do at the end of the service, our final service? Who gets the pulpit Bible? What do we do with the communion set? It's been in our church for 100 years. If we're closing our church, should we merge with another? Should we just disband and go to the church of our choice? These are all questions that I hope to approach in some way, shape, or form. But more importantly, many churches today amalgamate. And what I'd like to do is have a resource that will teach people in amalgamation to talk to each other. If there's going to be one church of the 3 or of the 4, to have people communicate with each other, and it's not going to be, well, we're moving to their church, we'll do the things the way they do it. It will become a new church for all of the people involved. We'll do things together in a way that we can all agree to. And that's the only way that people are going to feel at home in the new amalgamated church, when it does happen. I just have a basic table of contents right now, but it's, first part we'll be discussing about decisions. I really liked in one of the books that's Closing with Grace, the appreciative inquiry model that she put forward. I hope to expand on that a little bit in my resource. Also, the importance of community. If a church is closing and joining with other churches, they have to become a community, not 2 communities going to the 3rd community, but one community. And then I'm going to have some of the nuts and bolts issues, how to deal with presbytery, and hopefully I would love to deal with presbyteries, not just our presbytery, but all presbyteries, that they could have one resource person, a person trained in church closure. So when a congregation does come to that point in their life, they'll have a resource person who can walk them through it because they've experienced it and they've worked with it. That would be so important. And even because presbytery personnel are mobile, it's a volunteer situation, I would love to see at the Maritime Conference level, as part of a portfolio of some of the full-time staff there, one person should be a resource person for presbyteries and congregations when it comes to church closure. So these are things I hope to promote over the next year or so. And then what I'll do then is I'll enter lightly into what do we do with our investments if we have any, our assets, church records. I've corresponded with the folks at our Maritime Archives and stuff, and she was very helpful. Sarah sent me some details on that. So these are all things that we'll do, and then I'll give resources for closing processes. The United Church has a liturgies for closing, and there's just so many other things. And this will be developed in my closing manual that I hope to develop over the next short while. And what I'm hoping to do is have at least a general working copy for the 1st of January, but I'll probably revisit it over the next 6 months and expand upon it and get it going again. Thank you. How was that for time, Jody?
Did well, good.
Good, thank you.
Time for questions and answers. Or questions and more questions. David.
Thank you, Gerald, very much. I think I'm on. Whenever this issue, whenever I encounter this issue, it's usually in a case not too dissimilar from what you've been speaking about here, which is a focus on palliative care and how to manage the situation in a way which it kind of alleviates anger and things like this. And my question is, have you considered, and has this consideration influenced how you interpret your data? Have you considered the idea that by and large when a congregation closes, there's often one of 2 main causes. One cause is often demographics, that there is a sort of a shift from rural areas to
and that is one of them, sure.
like to urban areas. And then also it's possible that the massive loss of faith in Canada, if there has been a massive loss of faith in Canada and indeed the Western world, partly reflects on certain shortcomings in the church. And so what I'm suggesting here is that if either of these 2 reasons are a factor, then anger is surely appropriate. It's surely appropriate when, because of 21st century capitalism, or people have to go west to get work. It's surely a cause of anger if we feel that we haven't responded to Christ's call as we should have. And so what I'm suggesting is maybe there's a role for anger. Maybe anger might not be entirely misplaced at times. And I'm thinking of this in terms of your data, because if I ask my daughter questions about why she's hurting, she'll tell me straight away about various experiences while she was hurting, which caused her pain, and so she'll have banged her head. But by the time she gets to me and I say, "Sophie, why are you crying?" Cora laughed at me. No, but why are you crying? Well, then and you get down, and so maybe there's anger there, which is partially righteous anger, and maybe that should inform how we, or at least problematize our goal to get this anger as out of the way as possible, try and make it easy as possible for church leadership to close these things. And maybe that anger is actually instructive and important.
Yeah, I agree, David. And what I've seen is a lot of the anger is mostly because they don't know what is happening. And so anger comes out. They're not part of the whole process. So the anger is righteous in some ways. I've seen it. People had it right. Like when the church was boarded up without announcing to the congregation, the amalgamated congregation first. That was cause for righteous anger. Just a little statistic as well. While we're talking, we talked about like going from rural to metropolitan areas. Rural churches are closing at a much faster rate than metropolitan churches, but metropolitan churches are losing more members more quickly than rural churches. So we're bleeding in all aspects of that.
Another optimistic question?
Sorry.
Well, thank you so very much for bringing that big elephant over to sit on my lap. It is an important thing that's happening with our churches. And I'm wondering, like you started with the book that you said you really liked, Ending with Hope.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you see anywhere in our ministries that we could possibly tie those people who are left behind, rather by choice or geography or anything like that, where ministers might be starting up alternative kinds of worship for them, house ministries that would invite members close by into worship again without the church building, but still so they don't get left behind.
Yeah, that's, and I didn't approach that in my study because I had to limit it somewhat, but it certainly came up in conversations with a number of people. What do you do especially where I am now? I'm in a place called Juniper, New Brunswick, which is probably the most remote area of New Brunswick to be in. Wonderful people, but when the church closed, basically, they had to drive 20 kilometers to church. When this next church closes, and it will in the next couple of years, I'm sure, unfortunately, they're going to have to drive 45 minutes just to get to another church. So home church might be the aspect, might work well for them. And this congregation, I'm hopeful, whereas my last congregation I wasn't. Whenever I was in my last congregation, whenever I left to go on vacation, they hired somebody to come and do the service. This congregation, when I go away, they do it themselves. So they have the tools to begin working with. And yeah, they will probably, hopefully do that. And I see hope in that. My project, unfortunately, was not an optimistic project. It was never intended to be. But there is some optimism because we all have God's Spirit in us. And who knows where that's going to take us.
Another question?
Thank you, Gerald. I'm not here to defend the church's courts and processes. However, the subject you spoke to, I would assume, all had the opportunity to attend the meetings that were held and to read the information that was provided, even if it was scant. Would you consider that their own denial of what they knew was happening around them actually prevented them hearing what was being shared?
It's possible, Lawrence. But what's happening at the grassroots is people aren't hearing so much about, okay, like we're talking about our future now. We have, the United Church has a whole big thing happening now about the future of the church and everything else, but nobody's doing palliative care now. And this is what I'm hoping to address. We need palliative care now while we're discussing our future.
But you're dealing with a segment of the church's membership that has never had to think about the church's future because their church experience led them to believe they could safely assume the church would always be there.
Yep. I remember
So
growing up, the mill was never going to close.
the denomination is asking them to do something that doesn't come naturally to them.
Yep.
The other thing that I'd like to ask is, what theological questions come from your research? What is being raised by what you are describing?
Actually, Lawrence, I didn't have time to discuss that today, but what an amazing transformation I had in myself because of this experience. I found a theology in building. When I first came into ministry 5 years ago, I always said, no, forget the building, the people are the church. But there's a theology of time and place. There's a theology of being in those buildings, that when the buildings close, part of the experience of God has moved on. And I just felt so, well, actually, Jane helped me with that a little bit. We were talking one day, Jane and I had a talk about spirituality in Sackville one day. And this sort of just took it a bit further for me, that there is a theology of time and space. And so when a church closes, the disruption affects people. Does that answer your question at all?
Well, it identifies a question. I just want to know down the road what you're going to do with it.
Oh, well, actually, it's how can I say this? My mandate really, Lawrence, is to, of course, for the first part of our project was to define and discuss the experiences of people, which we've done. The second part is a manual of closure. I'll have to think about that. I haven't got that far yet in my, when I'm developing the manual, how I'll approach the theological aspect of it. But it certainly will be. I'm hoping to have a theology of hope going forward, that even though this is happening, Christ still exists, the Spirit still moves amongst us. And if we don't have that, then what's the use?
Just wondering if your resource is targeted specifically toward non-leadership congregants or toward ministers, and if it's identified as such so that someone that is still in denial might recognize that this might be for them, not for somebody that's in the loop.
It's for everybody. Depends on who's closing and where. Some people have strong leadership. In the churches that I surveyed, there was no leadership to speak of. New minister who had no experience. According to the interviews, lack of communication with Presbytery at the time. But that could be themselves. That could be their own lack of being able to communicate. I don't know. We didn't get that far with it.
Part two.
Yeah, we charge extra for second questions.
In my smaller churches, I have a minority of people who are on the internet. So the people who might need to read this would not have access to it if it were just online.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jane. And you know what? Most churches that are closing are that way. However, it'll also be a printable resource. So somebody who is online will be able to print it out and give it to the others. And I certainly won't charge for it. It'll be available to anybody who needs it.
2 more questions. Rachel.
Hi, Gerald. You had alluded that it was student ministers, newer ministers, maybe less experienced ministers that were in the position of closing these churches.
Yep.
Did you actively think about going to places where there was an experienced minister to see if they were closing churches?
No, I just stuck to one.
Do you, in your research, are there experienced ministers closing churches?
Sure. Oh, sure, yeah. I've talked to some, but not as part of my project, yeah.
It's a really good question, though. I mean, that's a really interesting
Yep.
piece, because
Yep.
oftentimes, newly ordained people are sent to rural charges, and do they have the equipment necessary to facilitate either its expansion or its palliative care, right? So it's a good, excellent question. Susan?
Thank you for your presentation. At the beginning, you talked about your own experience, a memory of kind of the glory days of the church, and when there's full staff and music and programs and a full complement of things going on, and I think probably I would guess that many people in the church today might have those same kind of memories of the glory days of the church.
Those
And
of us of a certain age, yes.
And I wonder, though, if we acknowledge our vulnerability in the faith community, and in that acknowledgement of our vulnerability, that none of us really know what the future holds. And in that, how do we continue to live out the gospel in that vulnerability? We're still, we don't know what's down the road. We don't know if we're closing or we're not closing or what. But in the in-between time, how do you subsist? How do you go forward? How do you live an existence there and still live out the gospel?
Well, yeah. Yeah, that, again, it wasn't part of my project itself, but personally, I think about that often, because how do we exist knowing that these things may happen or will likely happen? And if you look at the demographics, I mean, it's not, I know of a few ministers whose churches are growing. Most are not. And in fact, like I said, the stats said, in the past 30 years, we haven't had 1 year of positive growth in the United Church. So we have to look at our spirituality. We have to me, we have to have the discussions. So we have to just discuss it. We have to open up the conversations now that, okay, I think we should discuss while we're healthy what's going to happen when we're sick. And I think that way there we should be able to have a healthier spirituality at the same time. Because if you're bogged down in arguments and confusion in closing a church, spirituality takes a back seat, doesn't it? Whereas if you do it while you're healthy and you start working towards what's our future going to be, and again, the concept of appreciative inquiry enables you to have an optimistic sense of spirituality. Is that answering your question at all?
Any other questions?
One super brief one.
Excuse me.
It will be super brief, and you may not have looked at this at all. But you, at the start, you indicated that you'd done a lot of research in this area, and you showed a graph, and the graph was really, really interesting. One of the interesting things about it was that the rate of decline was dramatically slowed in 1971.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering,
The Second Vatican.
was that what it was?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because what happens, even in our church, the enthusiasm. Now this is just me guessing, okay?
Okay,
In my own
right.
opinion. But what happened with the Second Vatican, there was a whole enthusiasm about God again. It just opened the doors for so many people to. This is only personal research that I've done. I can't authenticate it, but the Second Vatican sort of opened the doors to a lot of people. Spirituality opened up again.
Interesting. Thank you.
Any other final questions, comments? We're pretty close to time. I heard the cups and saucers rattling outside. Kind of like that early Christmas morning when you hear Santa Claus kind of just underneath the tree. Just anticipate that for us all. Oh, Gerald, thank you. And I think what happened today is exactly what we need to have happen. A whole flurry of other questions came into view as you do the research. And that's the exciting thing about it. Like, I really want to know, when you do palliative care, what are some key ingredients that help facilitate the process, right? And the thing about advanced directives, which was really part of that last question, with advanced directives, the assumption with the person who's going to go into that is that they're going to die. You see, that's why you do it. You're healthy now, but you know that in the next 2 or 3 years. But a lot of our churches are in a position where we don't want to suggest that. You know, are you suggesting that we're going to die? Which takes a lot of courage to get us to a place where we're going to begin to ask advanced directives or put those into place so that we can meet the future.
Yep.
Boy, oh boy, you've raised a lot of really tough questions. You had a tough piece of research, and as you encountered people, your first encounter was with pain.
Yeah.
And it's a tough thing. And I also want to say I like very much the whole thought about building. Building has an iconic dimension in our unconscious, or in our conscious minds, where we see our churches, these seminal places in our development, and suddenly if they're closed or boarded up, and it's true not only of the churches, but we heard it too with the closing of post offices and buildings, and then the government thought the best thing to do is actually rip those buildings down, right?
Yeah.
So now we have this thing called vacant lots, right? But we all remember what was there a long time ago, and it's a source of pain, and you've highlighted that for us. Gerald, thank you so very much.
Just one more thing.
One more thing.
I want to thank Jane and Kelly for coming today. It was just a total shock for me, and I am so happy. Thank you, guys.